So obviously we are in the midst of an Australian federal election campaign. Pretty mundane when you compare it to what's going on in Ecuador at the moment, I believe.
Correct, mate. Now, you think, if people think our elections are exciting, they're not. I'll give you an exciting election. And I wanted to talk about the election in Ecuador because I think there's a few important developments that have come out of it, and I think that are going to essentially help shape Latin America and the future of Latin America as a whole, and also how that's reflected by the US empire as a whole as well. I think we have to remember lots of things that happen around the world and domestically serve the interests of the imperial hegemon that we are under, which is the United States here in Australia.
I was just going to say, I have to admit, I don't know what's really going on in the Ecuador election. However, from what I have heard, it sounds like almost a Bond narrative or a Hollywood film has taken place.
It is wild, man. So essentially, they finally concluded their elections. So they had 2 rounds of voting. The first round was in February, and it was too inconclusive to call. So they had a second round about a week or 2 weeks ago. Now, this story has everything. We've got drug traffickers. We've got banana oligarchs. We've got international cartels, mercenary firms, neoliberalism, a good right v left dynamic.
Ticks all the boxes.
Ticks all the boxes, man. So it's pretty wild. So I've been doing a bit of research on this subject. Lots of my kind of data and info I got from the Grey Zone, which has published a very good series of pieces by Oscar Leon. I believe is Ecuadorian himself. And he's kind of broken down lots of these kind of statistics and stuff as well. Also, I've been to Ecuador, as you probably know. It holds a very special place in my heart. It's a very beautiful country. And I think for those kind of reasons as well, it's important to point out the injustices that are going on there. Also, so we... essentially, the election was between the incumbent Daniel Noboa, and he's kind of like a centre right-wing character, representing kind of the imperialist right, shall we say, that has dominated lots of Ecuadorian politics. His opponent was Luisa Gonzalez, so she was kind of a more centre-left. She had a coalition government. And she was carrying on the legacy of Rafael Correa, who was a massive reformist president in Ecuador from 2007 to 2017. So this is kind of in that kind of pink tide of the early 2000s, where we had lots of these populist movements in Latin America, and there was kind of a brief period of national unity between them. So you had Evo Morales in Bolivia. You had Maduro, obviously, you had Chavez in Venezuela. You had the Kirchners in Argentina. So Correa was kind of the spearhead of that movement in Ecuador. So he advocated for, obviously, kind of more regional integration between Latin American nations, standing together, getting out the thumb of the US empire, for example. So he famously... kicked all the US troops and bases out of Ecuador, engaged in lots of kind of public spending, public funding, rapidly, reduced the poverty rates and the crime rates in Ecuador during his period of presidency. Interesting to note that after he left power, that was when Julian Assange got essentially kidnapped from the Ecuadorian embassy as well. So he was succeeded by a man called Lenin Moreno of his party also. Not good Lenin. Like, his name's Lenin. No, not good. But he essentially embarked on a huge austerity program, undid lots of the things that Correa had undertaken. And then since then, after Moreno, that party was then voted out. And then we had the billionaire banker Guillermo Lasso came into power. And then in 2023, there was like a parliamentary crisis. He had to step down. And then he was replaced by Daniel Noboa, the current president, who finished out Guillermo Lasso's term and has since been re-elected. So like Guillermo Lasso, Noboa is a billionaire. He's the son of one of Ecuador's richest families. They're essentially an export company. So famously, they export bananas. They've got Noboa bananas. There's other things that they export as well, but we'll get onto that in a little bit. So... the reason the election was consequential was so after the first round of voting, I've got the statistics here. Noboa edged Gonzalez with a vote count of 44.17 to 44% of the votes at a voter turnout of 82%. However, the coalition government headed by Gonzalez actually secured more seats in the assembly than Noboa's National Democratic Party by one more seat, so 67 to 66 seats.
Very close.
Very close. So this necessitated a secondary runoff vote on the 13th of April, in which Noboa's party, they ended up claiming victory with 55.65% of the vote compared to Gonzalez's 44.35%. However, voter turnout only increased by less than 1%.
So the vote increased by 10%?
His vote share increased by, 10%. The entire voter turnout only increased by less than 1%. And not only that, but this completely went in the face, completely disregarded all of the polling that was done beforehand in the country in the lead up to the second round, where not all of them, but the majority of polls showed a significant up to 6 percentage point lead for Gonzalez in the elections.
So what you're telling me, James, the numbers don't add up.
Don't necessarily add up. There's a statistic. I guess it's not impossible. It's very, very improbable that it went this way. So Luisa Gonzalez came out and she pretty much said, this is fraud. I don't want to accept this election because it's fraudulent. Not only was the vote count a bit dodgy, but her claim, Gonzalez's claims, they're not baseless. They include things like, for example, 18 polling stations in her strongholds were relocated at the last minute, cash bonuses being paid using IMF funds, the banning of foreign observer groups, false positives of ballots that forced the closure of polling stations where she held a wide lead. Very critically, martial law being imposed by Daniel Noboa in several of the states where Gonzalez was likely that were favourable to her. The complete denial of all voting rights to Ecuadorians living abroad, specifically in Venezuela, and Noboa campaigning illegally whilst in office in violation of court orders, evidence of ballot fraud, copies of altered ballots without signatures surfaced and being counted, but funnily enough, always favouring Noboa. So look, there was a couple little things at play that make you think, well, this was possibly a little bit dodgy. Additionally, you've had organisations like the Organisation for the American States, OAS, which we're both familiar with, and the EU, both pretty much straight away came out and they were like, no, Noboa is legitimate. All opposition needs to step down and accept his legitimacy. If only they did that in Venezuela. Do you remember the Venezuelan election recently where Nicolas Maduro won? I think a lot less fraudulent. I think their voting system is a lot more thorough. I think there were some irregularities there, but it didn't seem he wasn't declaring martial law. And they immediately said, Maduro, leave, you're not the legitimate leader, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously dual standards, but we're used to that in the third world. So Gonzalez has been running on kind of a continuation of the Rafael Correa platform and she actually received his endorsement of kind of increasing social services, indigenous representation, environmental protections. It's important to note Ecuador is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. It is absolutely scenically stunning. It's the high altitude, the top of the Andes, and where that descends into the Amazon rainforest. So it's an insane little pocket of biodiversity, of life. When you go to Quito, the capital city, it's just in the mountains, permanently just 26 degrees. It truly is a stunning place to go to. They're like, oh my God, this is amazing. Fun fact, they're actually heaps proud. They have a mountain in Ecuador, I cannot remember the name, but it is actually, if you measure from the center of the Earth's core to the tip of this peak, it's actually bigger than Mount Everest because it's located on the equator and the Earth bulges out at the equator. Of course, However, Everest is actually higher above sea level. So the Ecuadorians have a little flex. We've actually got a taller mountain. It's adorable. So she's running, and they also have in 2008, Correa introduced a new constitution, which I think it's a world-leading constitution in which it provides the environment the same rights as humans. So that still doesn't prevent the incredible exploitation of their natural resources, oil, rare earths, the destruction of their indigenous communities and their environment by mainly foreign-owned companies. I think of, I believe it was Chevron or Exxon, deliberately polluted large swaths of untainted rainforest. The journalist the lawyer John Donziger, we've discussed this before, has been locked up. So there are lots of things like that going on. But she was running on a platform of kind of a, again, more of a left-leaning, platform. Daniel Noboa is not really running on much. He's running on a tough-on-crime platform, vowing to stamp out the wave of violence that has surged over the country in the last 2 years. So when I went there in 2023, this was kind of just the beginning of this happening.
Yeah.
And it was very notably like one of the safest countries in Latin America. Very secure, pretty low-key, everything about it. Since then, its homicide rate has skyrocketed. It has a rate worse than Venezuela.
Wow.
Lots of this stuff has happened since he has come into power.
What's been attributed for that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things at play. I think, firstly, you have the Ecuador, since 2000, they have not had their own currency. They use the US dollar.
Oh, okay.
So the state isn't actually, I guess, stable and coherent enough to print their own dollar.
Yep.
So they're their own currency.
So no sovereign economic policy.
Yeah, and ever since Lenin Moreno seceded Correa, they've implemented huge austerity programs.
Yep.
So cuts to social services, cuts to healthcare, cuts to the many kind of basic staples of life. Mm-hmm. As we know, that obviously increases inequality, that increases poverty, that increases and crime, of course. Another thing that I think has been attributed to it is the, shall I say, institutionalization of narco traffickers and drug cartels and kind of these international gangs and networks.
Yep.
Now, lots of the time, these, how can I say it? As we've discussed before, these organizations actually seem to work in tandem with imperialism to further imperialist ventures.
Yes.
It's not necessarily a direct outgrowth, but they serve the same.
There's a correlation
interest.
there.
There is always a correlation. So in the last couple of years, Ecuador has become a hub for cocaine transit, obviously leaving the South American continent, along with like Peru and Bolivia. But obviously, as there's kind of the Caribbean and Mexico and Central America has become more militarized, this is a good hub to get large quantities of drugs into Europe and Asia as well, because it's on the Pacific coast. So we've seen a explosion in gang violence. The one that I thought was interesting is you have the Balkan gangs, who primarily consist of Albanians.
Wait, the Balkans in
gangs
Ecuador?
Yeah, it's a real shock. But yeah, so they actually control a large share of the the criminal underworld and the criminal networks in Ecuador. Lots of it's dictated by the Balkan gangs. What is very interesting is that the billionaire banker Guillermo Lasso, who preceded Daniel Noboa, he...
So this is banking billionaire president 1.0?
Yes, and his banks have been tied up in repeatedly money laundering cartel money.
There you go.
Yes, so that's why I talk about the institutionalization of these cartels, and as the more the state gets hollowed out, the more we will see these organizations fill that kind of structural power vacuum. Not only that, but Noboa, well, let's talk a little bit about this character. So this
is the current president.
He's the current guy who's just won.
Yeah.
So 37 years of age, he's the second youngest person ever to be elected in the president of Ecuador. He's actually born in Miami. So he's a dual US Ecuadorian citizen. And like all good US citizens, his loyalty is to the Star-Spangled Banner, to the US. Good man. So he was born in Miami, raised in Guayaquil in Ecuador, which is like Ecuador's biggest port. He's the son of Alvaro Noboa, a billionaire businessman and founder of the Noboa Corporation, an export business that primarily exports bananas amongst other items. So he's one of the richest men in Ecuador.
He's a banana oligarch.
He's a banana oligarch. And we're really going back to banana republics. We're going back to the late 19th century American conquest.
And I'm all for this.
Yeah, well, exactly. So according to the Panama Papers, he owns 2 offshore companies in Panama. And in fact, he actually owes the Ecuadorian government $98 million in unpaid taxes, which he has...
Is that 100 million US dollars?
US dollars
That's a lot
in
of money.
taxes, which he has said he is not going to pay. He's the head of state of this country, and he owes them 100 million in taxes. It is absolutely insane.
Could you imagine if the Australian Prime Minister owned $100 million in taxes, and then was like, I'm just not going to pay it?
Yeah, no, dude, that's what I mean. And it gets even funnier, dude. So you imagine he's running on like a tough on crime platform, and that was his excuse, right? So the tough on crime platform, that's kind of the standard right wing reactionary. It's like, you know, clamp down political dissidents.
Yeah.
And we've seen impose martial law in the areas where your challenger might beat you in the vote count. So he's running this tough on crime kind of platform. He in fact invited everyone's favorite like capitalist attack dog, Eric Prince, who is the founder of BlackRock, the definitely not controversial private military contractor, who were employed throughout the Middle East. It was so controversial they had to change their name. I think they're called Academy or something like that. Sounds like a tech company, but yeah. So he invited Eric Prince down to essentially cooperate on security matters, and they're both to get like, Eric Prince is like, yeah, this is great for Ecuador. We're obviously cooperating on these security matters because the violence and crime has gotten so out of control in Ecuador. We need to have a more militarized, outsourced, privatized solution.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Eric Prince's life goal is to privatize the entire US military. Like, so, and these are the kind of characters, and this is the kind of playbook as well that's being played in Argentina or being played in El Salvador, where you have these kind of quasi, not necessarily dictators, but these kind of quasi-militarists with a very authoritarian regime working in tandem with US capital to accentuate the power of US capital. So, for example, the US is paying Ecuador to take, paying El Salvador to take their prisoners, for example. Argentina, Javier Milei is just selling off his country's assets to the Americans, and also committing to defense and security arrangements with the Americans, with the Israelis, etc. So this is kind of the direction that he's going in. So as soon as I saw Eric Prince there alongside like Ecuadorian state forces locking down, you know, like civilian neighborhoods in the week before the election, I was like, all right, well, this is obviously dodgy as. But again, you think that if he's cracking down on crime, Noboa would actually be cracking down on illicit drug trafficking. Well, no, Geordie, he hasn't, because he has direct business interests embroiled in drug trafficking. Since 2020, Noboa Trading and its associated businesses have been caught hiding large quantities of cocaine in international banana shipments no less than 5 separate times. In 2020, 167 kilos were intercepted in Italy in banana containers shipped by Noboa Trading. In 2022, 260 kilos intercepted pre-export, so before they left Ecuador, in the port of Guayaquil in Noboa banana shipping containers. In 2022, 400 kilograms was seized in Noboa banana containers in Croatia. 2024, 600 kilograms were seized in Turkey in containers labelled Banana Bonita, which is a Noboa group entity under the Fruit Shippers Limited. 2025, 324 kilograms seized, destined for Italy in Noboa Trading banana boxes. So obviously that shows his direct interests are tied up in the perpetuation of narco-trafficking.
For sure.
Not only that, but we have the financial interests of the country, as represented by the bankers like Guillermo Lasso, laundering cartel money.
Yeah.
You have a large part of their export industry. They export bananas. They probably have other, you know, kind of niche products and fruits that many South American countries export as well. But like, in terms of the dollar amount, I'd imagine the cocaine export business would be more profitable than the fruit export business.
Yeah.
You know
I don't know, man. I think
in terms of like actual economics, I'm thinking about it purely as an economic commodity.
Yeah.
How profitable that is, and how well that's integrated into the system of the state.
Yeah, definitely.
Now.
Definitely. Have you ever thought that maybe he's just an incredibly skilled exporter, and he's found a really good relationship between bananas and cocaine?
He's obviously a very skilled exporter, dude. That's what I'm saying. He's obviously very good at it.
That's incredible.
But it's just very illegal, and it's just hilarious because, again, he's declared a war on gangs.
Yeah.
But he's carefully avoided mentioning groups like the Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and the Balkan cartels, instead focusing on like kind of small fry, little small bean kind of traffickers and, narco runners at the grassroots level.
I would love to see their media discourse and their kind of electoral campaigns. Is this openly discussed? Does the opposition just like refer to him as being like a banana narco trafficker?
Well, in the recent presidential debates, Luisa Gonzalez actually challenged him and was like, "Dude, like you're essentially like you're a drug trafficker.
You're a criminal.
Yeah, you're a criminal." And then she goes, "How about this? How about we both do drug tests?
Really?
Straight away after this campaign,
Wow.
and we'll see who's clean and who's not." And he was just kind of like, dodge that one and just again never addressed at all.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yes, it's hilarious. So the security body responsible for inspecting and handling shipping at Ecuadorian ports, the Customs Intelligence Unit, has an annual budget. Guess how much that annual budget is, Geordie?
Is it massive or is it just... No, it would be tiny. It'd be like...
The annual budget is $33,633 US.
Yeah.
And of July 2024, only just over $5,500 had been dispersed. So that's So there are Aussie tradies in the mines making more money in a week than this government is allocating to combat a multi-trillion-dollar industry.
Yeah, so he's just hollowed out the customs to ensure that he can just export and
and he's
import
like
cocaine.
$5,000. But dude, if you're a customs official in Ecuador, like their wages are quite low, but like some dude is slipping you $100 to look the other way on said banana shipment. Of course, you're going to look the other way.
Definitely.
And that's kind of that's the main issue, is that now that it's become, shall we say, sanctioned by the state on these really high levels, how do you get it out? You can't.
No, you can't.
You know what I mean? And that's, I think, a similar issue that I think the Mexicans are dealing with now. I think they're probably dealing with it a little bit more effectively.
Yeah.
But all of these countries in South America have this similar problem. So it's absolutely wild, man. So, for example, the port of Guayaquil handles 70% of Ecuador's shipping. Between 2018 and 2023, it's estimated to have handled over 2 million banana containers. However, less than 40 containers have been intercepted. So, again, that shows how little control and power and funding these bodies actually have to do something about it. But why would you do anything about it when the president of your country is the main beneficiary of shipping the cocaine? But it's one of those places where that kind of this movement of kind of bananas, cocaine, dark money, geopolitical interest, that kind of creates a nexus that dictates the political realities on the ground, but it's also very important geostrategically.
Yeah.
As we've seen, the Trump administration has come in and you have the Marco Rubio types, those kind of like satanic Latinos who are on a mission to destroy any sort of vaguely left-leaning government in South America. Yeah. So obviously Bolivia is always in their sights, but Bolivia is kind of small fry. They've kind of compromised Lula in Brazil enough to he's kind of doing roughly within their acceptable scope of boundaries. But you've got Colombia, headed by Gustavo Petro, and notably Venezuela.
Yeah.
It's very important to remember that in order to isolate Venezuela, you need to have Colombia on side, and Colombia isn't really on side. So we have greater integration and cooperation between those two countries. Ecuador is adjacent to Colombia on the other side. So if you have that bloc all united, then that is going to pose a big problem and a big impediment to imperial interests, to imperialism in the area. Additionally, so Noboa has come in and pretty much said, we want to have we want to further defence ties with the United States. We want to have more free trade agreements, which will benefit our capitalist class and destroy whatever smaller industries we have. And we are also completely open to the idea of putting US soldiers back on Ecuadorian soil.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to talk about this election, because I think it's very important, because it will shape the future of this part of the continent.
Yeah.
So funnily enough, the Americans actually back in the Second World War, they wanted to have the Galapagos Islands they had the Galapagos Islands partially as a base, and I think they wanted to keep doing it, but due to obvious environmental concerns, they decided not to. However, I think it's the kind of thing when Noboa's like, yeah, you know, if you allow me to keep trafficking cocaine, it would be that kind of under the table deal.
Yeah.
You can have a military base wherever you want, put one on the Galapagos, destroy the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of that is going to play a factor. And again, I think for the future of these incredibly wealthy parts of the world, as imperialism and capitalism kind of reaches its final stage of, shall we say, self-destruction, they're going to be scrambling more and more violently to sink their claws into these resource-rich, undiscovered parts of the world.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is super evident. And I think all of these kind of imperialist vectors have all kind of essentially formed a matrix which has all come together and converged in this perfectly in this story, where you've got the dodgy banking class, the symbolism of the banana exporting republic, whose natural wealth is purely just exported over, you know, to other nations. You've got the drug trafficking. You've got the power projection of the US military. I think all these things come, and you've also got the further immiseration of a working class, of the average everyday Ecuadorians. And I think all these points kind of come together really well, and they really, I think, perfectly illustrates what US imperialism is in Latin America. And I think going forwards, it's going to be more and more critical, because essentially the purpose of a man like Noboa in government is to prevent any further regional integration and prevent the formation of kind of unified blocks in the region. And unfortunately, as long as they keep doing that, as bad as it sounds, the populations in these countries will continue to suffer and will never be able to achieve the levels of development that their natural wealth and human ingenuity has bestowed upon them.
Yeah, wow. These stories really do show you how the US is not serious about tackling drug crime and drug imports into America. Because at the same time, they prop up Noboa, they prop up these right-wing banking oligarchs and allow them to ship cocaine into America.
Up every single narco dictator over the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and then the moment you get a left-wing reformist that comes in that actually wants to create institutional change, they're the ones that are overthrown by the US empire.
Exactly. We can see that in Mexico with the Sheinbaum government, where as soon as she comes, as we've discussed many times on the pod, as soon as she comes in, it gets like, we need to start drone striking Mexico to attack the cartels. Oh, really?
Yeah.
You guys trained cartels members at one stage. Or you've got, for example, Noriega in Panama, who is the loyal narco.
Is he still in prison, or did he just get out?
I think he died a couple of years ago. But but he was a faithful man to the
faithful servant of the US
servant
empire.
of the CIA. And when he started being slightly too nationalistic,
using cocaine money to fund schools.
God, you've got to do something with it. Do that at least, you know. But then as soon as he started getting slightly too nationalist-minded, Operation Just Cause, we got to invade Panama. Everyone's forgotten about that.
Wow.
These situations will continue to develop. We will continue to cover them, as always. Solidarity with all the brothers and sisters and comrades over there in the Andes. You're doing it hard, and we're thinking of you.
Incredible. So. Thanks, James. That was an incredible story.
No worries, mate. Like, comment, subscribe. Hugs and kisses. We'll see you next time.